My presentation is how to effectively use electronic communication. We're going to go over how to use this from a business aspect. I'm not going to delve into like the personal aspect of email communication. The first slide we're going to go over, which is the next one here. When to use e-communication, email communication or text messaging, things of this nature. The examples are the recipient is mobile, and this comes into play when you have a recipient that's always on the go. You can't really catch them at a good time for a phone message or other type of communication like that. Also, it's very useful if they're out of your time zone. You can also reach them by email communication easier than a phone message. Another thing is the message is time sensitive, and this is if you really want them to have the information right then. You need them to read it immediately after you send it. Another one is you need to attach data. This could mean like you're attaching a Excel file or a spreadsheet to the document that you cannot send normally. So that would be useful. Or the message being sent to a big group of people. If you're trying to send the same communication to a large group of people, e-communication, emails as such, is very useful for that task. Also, something useful is if you need a record of the message. If you're going to need something to prove that you sent this email out, email is a good form of that. Have records on the server, records on the client side as well of the email communication. Let's go on to the next slide, which is when to not use e-communication. Go ahead and change that. A couple of examples is if the message is long and complicated. If you're trying to explain something to someone and it's not very brief or it's very overly complicated, it might be easier to say it in person, then email might not be the best way to communicate this information. Another one is the message is highly confidential. Email at its best is not overly secure, so if you're trying to communicate something that you don't want to leak out, then possibly another form of communication would be better. Also, if the message is emotionally charged, meaning if you have an emotion that you actually want to get across to the recipient, you want them to understand your emotion behind the message, and probably email would not be the best form of communication in that scenario. Moving on to the next slide. This one's titled, Who is the Audience? So it's very important to know who your audience is. It's good to ask yourself before you start the message who your audience is, what is your audience's relationship to you, and what impression you want to make. So basically, knowing your audience will better prepare you for the email message that you're about to send. Be able to format it in a way that they can understand it better if you know who they are and what they expect from an email. And also, if you would decide what impression you want to make before you send the email, then you can better prepare for the message itself. The next slide is important components of email communication. There's basically three components to an email: subject lines, salutations, CC and BCC. So we want to be careful when you're filling these fields out. You need to know a good subject line for your email communication. The salutations need to be appropriate for the email you're sending. From a business standpoint, you probably want to have a very formal salutation and ending for your email. You want to be too casual if you're sending it for business purposes. Carbon copy and blind carbon copy is if you're sending this to other recipients besides the main recipient. Blind carbon copy actually makes it where no one can see that you're sending it to them. So you want to use these efficiently and carefully as well. Next one. Tips on effective communication. Some quick tips on what you could do to help your emails or electronic communication to be better. Think about it and reread it. Basically, that's self-explanatory. You just want to think about what you're going to type in your message. You want to reread it, especially if it's of a business matter. Reflect on your tone of message. Make sure it's the tone that you actually want to be sending along with your message. Clarity and brevity are very important. You don't want to be overly verbose in your emails. You want them to be very clear and to the point. Easy to read. You want them to be easy for the recipient to read it. You don't want them to be overly confused with the message. That can affect the actual message being received by the recipient. Respect privacy. If you're emailing a large group, something of a private matter, you want to make sure that that is appropriate. You wouldn't want to send some private out to a large group that it shouldn't be made known to everybody. Avoid noise. And what this is talking about is just unnecessary language or information in the email itself. You want it to be as concise as possible. Easy to understand. We want the recipient to be able to understand it without any problems, so they can really go over what they're reading. Some questions that you want to ask yourself when you're sending that email. Is the message suitable for email? Would it be better served if you use a different type of media? Could you use a voicemail or a in-person communication? Would that be better? It'd be wise to ask yourself before you send it. Will the reader read this email? Will it stand out to the reader? Will they actually read it? If the receiver is getting a lot of emails a day, how is your email going to stand out so they'll actually read it? How will the messages look? This includes the formatting of the email, making sure there's nothing overly flashy in the email if it's a professional email. Have I provided enough information? Even though you want to be concise and brief to the point, you don't want to leave out important information in the email that they will actually need to know. Have I identified myself? Make sure that your identity is well known, that they know who it's coming from. If you're from another company, sending it to another company, you want them to know that, what position you are in the company. Will the reader be able to see the attachments? It's always a good idea to test any attachments you're sending to make sure that they can actually open them, they're not corrupt. Make sure that they'll actually pass through your firewall filter so that they will actually get the attachment. These are things to consider before continuing on. So in conclusion, we went over several things. The main points for email communication: proofreading is a must. You want to make sure that you proofread all your emails. Brevity is important, and even though that is important, you want to make sure that you have all the information needed in the email. Also, you want to know your audience. Make sure you know who the audience is, if they will be able to receive the email, if they will be able to understand it, if it will be applicable to them. Know your message that you're sending, so that if you know your message, then you can explain it better, and it will be all in the email. Some other things that we can, some other things that you can do to help you with your email communication. If you're emailing a large group, something of a private matter, you want to make sure that you have all the information needed in the email. Also, you want to quick are the handouts at the beginning. The graph that y'all had handed out basically just shows the use of email from 95 when email first basically started to 07. As you can see, there's a huge increase in that time of email communication. It is something that is very important in today's society. Everybody uses it, so it's good to know what to do in that scenarios. The other information is 5 pitfalls to avoid. Another handout that I gave you. Basically just goes over 5 points that would be useful to avoid when you're creating your email. Do not assume that only your intended recipient will read the email. This is very true in case it could be forwarded to a number of people. Make sure that that is okay, or you have some kind of a security in place where that won't happen. An email is a writing, not a conversation. This is the difference between an email and a text message. Text message is more like a conversation you'd have maybe on a personal note. Email needs to be more formal in a business scenario. It's always good to keep in mind. Heated discussions via email are ineffective. And this goes back to the emotionally charged point we had in the slideshow. If you're wanting to convey an emotion through your communication, going there in person probably would be more effective than trying to convey that through an email. Step back and reread before you hit send. This is something that we've gone over several times, and it is very important. You need to know your information before you send it. It takes a few minutes just to reread your email. You can find all sorts of mistakes and errors that you can correct before sending it. This is a very important step before you want to send that email. Be careful not to forward privileged information. This goes back to the privacy issue. If you're having some information that does not need to be disseminated amongst a lot of people, you want to keep that private. You need to make sure of your target audience, make sure that that is who you're indeed sending it to, instead of sending it to people that you don't know. And this also goes back to the number one issue, that just remember that once you send that email, it can be forwarded to many other people. So just keep that in mind when you are sending email. That's all the information I have. I appreciate you listening to what I have to say.
Very good.